So thank you everyone for joining us today for the Environmental Justice Pathways Youth Artist Debut. My name is Haley K. Scott, and I'm the Climate Justice Grassroots Organizer for Beyond Toxics and the NAACP Eugene Springfield chapter, and I will be moderating our panel today. So this is the third webinar of our Environmental Justice Pathways webinar series, which will lead up to an in-person summit at the University of Oregon in April 2021. For updates and to view past webinars, you can go to beyondtoxics.org. And today we are excited to be joined by 4 local youth artists who are leading the way in addressing environmental injustices and are using creative solutions to inspire effective change in their communities. Before the Environmental Justice Pathways Summit was postponed due to COVID-19, these 4 artists were invited to showcase their submissions at the summit. And so to make the art showcase more accessible, we have moved this element of the summit to take place online. And before we move on, I would like to give a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are on Kalapuya Ilihi, the homelands of the Kalapuya people. This land is still occupied by descendants of the First Nations of the Willamette Valley. We are honored to share the land and have a part in safekeeping its resources for future generations. While we are guests in the homelands of the Kalapuya people, we set our intention to care for the land, water, and air and protects the gifts they offer. We are committed to respecting the rights, traditions, and knowledge of the Winfeli Kalapuya people. And so here is just a quick agenda of how the webinar is going to be structured today. So I'm just going to go really quickly over the Zoom functions, and then we'll move on to our panelist introductions. And then we'll go into our presentation and performance portion of the webinar. And finally, the last portion of this webinar will be for a Q&A discussion. So as I said before, all participants will be muted and your videos will be turned off. And if you have a question, send it to us using the Q&A function, or you can raise your hand and we'll try to get to you as soon as we can. Oops, one too many slides. Okay, so now I will introduce our panelists and they will present their work in the order they are introduced. So first up, we have Grace Burks. Grace is a sustainability activist, a regenerative agriculture enthusiast, and proponent for all things soil. She is a poet and an honors undergraduate with ambitions to work within the field of international agriculture, championing sustainable practices and advocating further integration of the triple bottom line: planet, profit, and people. And next up, we have Naile Nevarez. Naile's work explores storytelling as a tool to help others build empathy for the lived experience of marginalized communities, focusing on digital mediums such as video, animation, and web apps. She searches for ways to incorporate interactivity and emotion, powerful tools to immerse viewers and facilitate empathy. And next after Naile, we have A.W.W. A.W.W., a young, non-binary individual, will be reading Howling, a written piece that challenges violent narratives through creative works, poetry, and performance art. And then finally, we will have Paul Wilson. Paul is a photographer and cinematographer who uses storytelling to document the sovereignty of tribal nations and water stewardship. And today we will be watching a short film he developed titled Rios to Rivers. So we are going to get started with our presentations, and I'm excited to let Grace take it over and start with her poem. So go ahead, Grace.
Awesome. Thank you, Haley. Okay. From they who voicelessly screams, the unborn children. 1. They screams, help! The starving children. OCD cracks my knuckles into ravines. Gaping deeper are the chapped lips of the farmlands parched by tillage and flaked from soil. The top escaping to the vents of vantages of no restore. 2, they screams, stay, the homeless children. OCD erodes my gums at an eighth of a fraction of a pinch of the speed the human race vanishes with glaciers, incinerates with forests, and extincts with and in entire species. 3, they screams, stranger, the kidnapped children. When I crack my pinky toe, the ground quakes. My trembling feet tectonize plates, leaving trails printed with desperate carbon, who so carelessly murders species to extinction. 4, they screams, Mom, the orphan children. Insomnia warps my eyes warmly into sockets of plastic pillaged into mountains, who have shrunken into mantles and skins of Mom, who burns deceased.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Grace. And so we are going to follow up Grace's wonderful poem with a video that was created by Nelly Navarez. And it is titled, it's in honor of Homero Gomez Gonzalez. And let me share my screen here really quick and we'll get it started. Thank you so much, Nelly. That video is really powerful. The first time I watched it, it brought a lot of emotion out, so thank you so much. And so now we're gonna go ahead and let A.W.W take it over and they can read our poem. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. This piece is entitled Howling. I went walking, with life beating on one side, death flatlining on the other. Trees, like my friends, were balanced on either side. Proud ponderosas between patches of fertile marshes on the left. Parallel was fire-licked manzanita creeping towards ridges arched against an autumn sky. Life bleeding, death defining. I walked between the lines until I heard a creek twinkle. Deer trails laid me down amongst the dusty grass. The nuthatch tweeted between branches, and I sang to the wind. I've missed her, and now I hear her whisper my name and the names of all others. She hums a tune so sweet. She lends her story to my ear like a lover, her tone so soft it barely makes a sound. She waves from the treetops and my body sways to her songs. I've promised to write them. I've promised to read them. I've promised to speak them aloud to you. So we understand how we are whole, how we live and die in the steady heartbeat of it all. Come howl with me upon the ridge. Come watch the rolling ripples of valley sink into a fire-framed sunset. Come see how the stars are telescopes for all the things there ever was and ever will be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, A.W.W. That was great. I'm going to go ahead and let Paul go ahead and present his video, and I'm going to share it right now. Paul's video is titled Rios to Rivers. Crystal, there's no sound.
Dad has always taught me that the water that runs through our rivers, our creeks, our headwaters, our springs, and that sits in our lakes, he's taught me that that's the same blood that runs through my veins.
I was a fisherman my whole life, and when I was 14, I ran my own commercial crew out here on the Klamath River. I've noticed that the fish population has declined at a rapid pace, and we used to go out there and catch, quite a few fish at a time, and now we can only barely go out there for hours at a time and be lucky to catch one. So I thought it was a time to actually put down my boat and start fighting for the river.
It makes me happy to know that everything that our grandmothers and grandfathers have fought for and everything that we have fought for in this lifetime will be passed down to a generation that we can trust. And it makes me happy to see that on a global scale.
Mi abuela me decía que mapuche significa gente de la tierra. Yo he vivido casi toda mi vida a las orillas del río Biobío.
In a way, it's kind of sad to see this river because it's so beautiful. When I go home, it makes me want to be more involved. Educate the younger generation too, because they don't know the difference of a clean, healthy river and a river that's sick. And that's what we're at back home.
It's crazy how similar it was for like the Biobío and Klamath, and to know that they're fighting what we fought. Why would they still want to put dams on these rivers when they see us like fighting to take them out?
I want the UN to stop recognizing dams.
Stop recognizing.
Yes. We're here to expand awareness of the damage dams can do and maybe get the UN to stop approving dam projects that result in the death of an ecosystem, a language, and a people.
We need to acknowledge dams for what they truly are, and that's modern day genocide.
If we don't stand up and tell people the conditions of this river, they'll never know. If we don't stand up and fight for the rights of our people, the next generation will never know that we had them start. One day the world is going to need people like us, and I believe that day is now.
Awesome. So I hope everyone was able to hear it that time. And thank you so much, every one of you. I mean, this is just so amazing to be able to have you all share your work with us and just able to see the different forms of expression that we can use to talk about environmental justice and what that means for a younger generation using alternative forms of communicating. And I just think it's so important to think about the ways in the intersections there are between all of these different ways of knowing and these different ways of thinking. So thank you again. And now I want to open up the rest of the webinar for a Q&A. And so how it's going to happen is that we will take questions and answers in the chat function, and then try to answer them each as we go through them. And I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen because I had a suggestion that it might be a little easier for the audience to ask questions if they can see questions as well. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up my slides. And then I'll just do a new slide as we get questions. So I guess to start it off, and this is going to be an open question, but if we can start with Paul, what was your inspiration for the piece you submitted? And then after Paul, let's popcorn it after that, because I would love to hear from all of you.
Hi, everybody. The piece I submitted was a short form of a full-length documentary that I'm producing. It's an effort to raise awareness in the wake of the largest dam removal in history to take place in 2022. It will take place on my river, on my ancestral waterways, Emmet River. My tribe has stewarded these lands and waters of this region since time immemorial, and this film and my work with my stewardship is just an extension of that practice.
That's great. Thank you so much. So I guess we can go on. And Nayeli, why don't you tell us about your video?
Yeah, so my video, as kind of mentioned in the ending portion of it, was inspired by Homero Gomez Gonzalez. He was a monarch butterfly activist and a politician, and the first time I came across his work was, unfortunately, when I learned of his death. There were several images like circulating around him on social media explaining that he had been murdered and that his body was found in the well, and you know, it was speculated that he was killed because he had been fighting to protect the forest against logging, and as well as the fact that just people in the area who are environmental activists had been murdered like recently. And so I was particularly moved by like the image that I showed at the very end. That was the image I saw on social media of, you know, like this man embracing these butterflies. And I felt like it was so beautiful. And I also felt like it really captured his passion and like the essence of his work, which was to like communicate that we should care about all living things. And so yeah, after I saw that, I did a little bit more research on him. I came across his Twitter activity. He would frequently post just like videos of him at the butterfly sanctuary. And one of the videos, he ends it by saying in Spanish, "Butterflies are lovers of the sun and the souls of the dead." And those words really stuck with me and were basically like the inspiration for the entire video, because I wanted to spread visibility on this issue, but also help like amplify the message of his work through an art piece.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you so much, Nayeli. And then so A.W.W, I would love to hear about your poem and what inspired you to write it.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking, Ailey. It was a long series of events, but it kind of culminated into this week-long like camping and therapeutic time that I took for myself. That was just this like really vital experience to feeling and understanding some of my own suffering. And that honestly helped me kind of open up and begin to witness just a lot of the suffering that happens to other people and to other species and to the land. And so it sounds kind of dreadful, but the suffering led to so much like empathy and curiosity and action. And one of those actions is just by writing about it through my poetry. So that's kind of, yeah, the muse behind that poem.
Yeah, most definitely. And we're getting a lot of great comments on everybody's work. So just take that in mind as we move through these questions. So Grace, why don't you take it away and let us know what inspired you?
Sure. So my educational background right now has really inspired me. I'm majoring in agricultural science and sustainability and minoring in comparative international agriculture and Spanish. And so much of my coursework is framed around sustainable communities and farming systems. At the time that I wrote this piece, I was actually walking between classes and heading to a soil science lecture. And soils are greatly affected by climate change. And I really wanted to personify carbon, plastic, and erosion as they have the ability to shape the future of our soils and our farming and thereby our future. I was also inspired by future generations that don't have the ability to fight for their rights, and the youth generation and future youth generations are losing their rights to a safe and healthy planet, and disproportionately so for minority communities.
Yeah, I mean, in listening to you all speak to your inspiration, it seems like place is a really important aspect and how we relate to the problems that are going on and how we can think about our relationship with the earth and why it's important. So I really thank you all for answering that question. It can kind of be, you know, a big question to answer because there's just so much in the world that can be inspiring. So thank you all for, you know, providing those answers and those emotions. So I guess the next question, what we're getting in is whose voices are missing from the environmental and climate justice movements and conversations? And how can we better center those voices that aren't traditionally represented in these conversations? And this is kind of an open-ended question. So whoever would love to volunteer, thank you so much to go first.
Yeah, I can go.
Okay.
In my piece, I specifically speak to the future generations of children who don't yet have a voice, and I think it's really important to center their voices because we're not only fighting for our future, but for theirs too. And this isn't directly in my piece, but I think it's really important to discuss the marginalized groups that are suppressed and most affected by climate change, because listening to those voices will help to empower future youth generations. An article was published by the University of Michigan that stated that minorities and low-income communities' voices aren't heard because of the challenges they face, and those include a lack of resources and political clout. And I'm actually going to share a small little PowerPoint here with some statistics. Sorry about that. In 2017, there was a study published titled Toxic Waste and Race at 20. And it was published by the Environmental Research Letters Journal. And they found that over half of those within less than 2 miles from a hazardous waste facility are people of color. Environmental hazards most strongly correlate with racial and socioeconomic disparities, which is highlighted by this study and several others. In another study, which is summarized in this figure, We Don't All Breathe the Same Air, there was significant difference in air quality between races. And that was a study conducted by Clark, Millett, and Marshall. Their study was titled National Patterns in Environmental Injustice and Inequality, Outdoor Nitrogen Dioxide Air Pollution in the United States. 2 key points that I found from this figure and study are among urban residents, nitrogen dioxide concentrations for Black Hispanics, who are the most exposed race ethnicity group, are 38% higher than the total urban population. And also that the average nitrogen dioxide concentrations were 10% higher for people below versus above poverty level. Environmental and climate justice movements and conversations can't continue without recognition of these disparities and without hearing from those who are most affected. It's really important to hear from minority voices to shift the power and to best represent climate change and environmental discussions. Visibility often creates validity and will empower the movement. And here I have an image of a man named Abdan Nababan, who represents the Batak people. He's an Indonesian environmental activist. This picture was taken from an article written by Manga Bay in 2018. And in a climatic briefing titled Voices That Must Be Heard, Minorities and Indigenous People Combating Climate Change, Braun Miller quoted him and what he felt of environmental activism. And so I kind of want to end on his voice to, again, strengthen a minority perspective. So he says, why this is very important for Indigenous people is because they live in ecologically sensitive areas. They are already victims of violations by governments. Climate change makes their daily life worse.
Wow, Grace, thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, that's all such really important information. You know, underrepresented communities, minority populations, low income populations are all disproportionately impacted by climate change and environmental injustices. So I think a follow-up question that would go really good right here and let us transition to let another speaker answer is Paul. And it's coming from Craig Patterson, and it says, regarding the dam removals, how long do you anticipate it will take for the sediment and temperature of the river to return to equilibrium?
Yeah, thank you for that question, actually. And there's really no way of knowing within the Klamath River how long it will take. We're currently waiting. The dam removal will be turned over to the Klamath River Renewal Corporation. It's a newly formed nonprofit, and they will handle. They are currently planning the removal process itself, and they've been doing studies to see what that will look like. I kind of look at the Elwha River. The Elwha is currently the largest dam removal in history right now, and it serves as an example. It's been 9 years since the Elwha was undammed, but the Elwha was only 45 miles long and only had 2 dams on it. The Klamath is 257 miles long, and it has more than 4. It has, I think 9-ish. But we're taking out the 4 major dams on the Klamath, and we have heavy agricultural use on it, and so I don't know what that will look like within the aquifer and the system itself. But I'm going to see if I can't share my screen right now. I have some images pulled up of the Elwha just to give an example of what that looks like. And let me know if you guys can see this. Haley or Crystal, could you guys share? They should be loading in the Google Doc. They're called Elwha 1, 2, and 3.
Haley, can you share that?
Yeah, Paul, I'm trying to find where you put them. Are they in a place that's accessible to me? Or do I already have them?
Yeah, within that folder.
Okay.
You can drop the link in the chat box to one of us.
Here, I got it right here. I got Elwha 1 and I got another one. So let's do this. Okay, here we go. Hide myself.
And so there you can see the Elwha has really, it's reclaimed. Speaking with the tribal officials there, that the Elwha Department of Natural Resources and their GIS folks, we were able to kind of look at the revival. Their removal was based primarily on salmon fisheries. They're a heavily salmon dependent community, and their salmon have retaken and they've gone farther than 75 miles up towards the headwaters of the Elwha system. And so largely they've been able to come back within the last 9 years. That being said, it does have disastrous long-term effects on the river. So yeah.
And then we got.
And here you can see the removed dam. And there's sediment to the bottom right, that orange sediment. But you can also see the path of where that reservoir used to be. And the dam removed itself. There's arms there. You can visit this and walk out to the edge of that and look down. It's a really powerful place to be as somebody that's tied to a river in a community that's been dependent on a river that's seen such disastrous effects. And so I encourage you, any of you that are able to, it's a little bit of a walk in. I think it's like 3.5 miles, but oh my gosh, it's gorgeous. It's in the lands of the Elwha and Lower Clallam people up there, and it's in the Olympic National Park, and it's gorgeous.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you got one more image, Paul, is that correct?
Yeah. And here you can see the size of what that reservoir, this is the top reservoir above the uppermost dam on the Elwha. And so you can see the braided river system within this, and then what the reservoir did to the landscape. And so there's no way of knowing how long the toxic sediment will stay in place. My hope is that it allows some of our traditional, the indigenous fish populations to return to help start to deal with the toxic algae bloom that we see within the Klamath Lake and our waterway.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing those images, Paul. I think it's really great to have a visual, and when you're talking, you know, place really matters, and if you can't see it, it really, you know, it doesn't elicit any type of emotion a lot of the time. So I just think it's so important, you know, when you're talking about a place, to actually see it, actually experience it and breathe it. And so that kind of makes me think about A.W.W's poem, and I would really love to hear from you about, like, what role does place play in that poem, and how can our understanding of place change our perspective on how we protect Mother Earth?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, this poem is actually specifically about a place. It is about the landscape that is up, now known as like Bend, Oregon. So kind of that high alpine desert sort of ecosystem. And in all honesty, just from writing this poem and having time spent in that land and having so much arise from having a lot of experiences happen in this one place, I can just imagine and feel so solidified in the knowledge that one could really commit themselves to a place if you've been there for long periods of time. I mean, and you can see that with indigenous people all throughout the globe, is just that commitment to place, as well as like the way in which other ways of feeling connected to an area not only helps you feel committed to that area, but it helps you understand what you need and what other people in your community need, and how you can support each other in doing that in a sustainable way for the people that you're with, but then also the land that you're with, because it becomes this kind of, it becomes a dialogue between the people and the other species in the area, as well as the ecosystem and the land. So yeah, I feel like place is incredibly important, not only in art, but in literature, in economics, in policy. And I definitely think like having grounding or having the connection to place is very helpful in terms of combating the climate crisis. You know, people that have that understanding of what that specific area needs are going to understand the best steps moving forward for that place. And yeah, so and that was just from only spending a certain amount of time in Bend, Oregon. So it could, you know, take that and expand that by so much more if you've spent a long period of time in one spot.
Yeah, most definitely. I really appreciate that. And I think that, you know, it kind of provides a really good transition for a question I would like to ask Nayeli. Since we're talking about place and places we've been, what role or what can we do to connect with places abroad? You know, when we're thinking about the video you showed and all of the Indigenous activists who are experiencing these injustices, you know, how can we better support those movements? What can we do?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, I feel like something that is like key to maybe doing that is just understanding how interconnected we are with the world, other than what might be like our initial perception. My sophomore year, I studied abroad through semester at sea, where it was a multi-country study abroad program. So we went across Asia and countries in Africa. And the one thing I took from it was, this like sense of realizing that these fictitious borders, you know, make us feel like we don't impact each other, or like each country is its own little entity and we just like stay within the boundaries. But we really have to think about like our world is completely interdependent and able to impact each other in positive and negative ways. For example, you know, like e-waste, the way that wealthier countries such as like the United States or the UK or China like illegally dump their electronics in other countries such as Southeast Asia, like in that area, and also in countries in Africa, or I mean, not related to the environment, but also somewhat related, is like just the way that the US kind of, you know, drug, like gun traffics, like guns to like South America, you know, essentially kind of like funding like violence and stuff. And so anyways, there's a lot of examples in which like that prove that we do impact each other in all these ways. And I also think that the ways we can contribute are not all that different than the ways we fight for justice in our own country, because they might take a little bit more research. But for example, you know, with everything that's happening with like Black Lives Matter movement, like where it started, Minnesota with George Floyd, like I have never been to Minnesota. You know, it's as foreign to me as, you know, Australia is. However, I don't feel like I need to have ever been there to know that there are ways I can contribute to this movement that affects people in places that I've never been to. So I think we can contribute in very similar ways. It just may take more research to understand exactly what, you know, people are going through in that area, and, you know, what organizations are doing the work. But we can like fight for justice in very similar ways, like donating, signing petitions, you know, holding protests, like all of that I feel like is just as effective for issues abroad.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm so happy that you brought up, you know, how many similarities there are in different ways that we can advocate. You know, although we are trying to address climate change, I mean, there's so much that goes behind that. You can't address climate change if you're not addressing, you know, racial disparities, if you're not addressing economic disparities. It's all interconnected. And, you know, if we are able to come together and increase our understanding, because everybody's going to come in with a different level of understanding. And I just think that awareness and, you know, striving towards ways that we can stand in solidarity is just so important. So thank you for that. And since we have about 11 minutes left, it looks like we have another question in the queue. And this seems like another open question to everyone that I would love to hear an answer, since we have a little bit of time. And hopefully, you know, it can kind of bring it together. And that is, what does artistic expression bring to the environmental justice movement? Does anyone want to take that on, or I'm going to call on someone?
I can start.
Okay, thank you, Nyla.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that sometimes there's like a misconception with art about the value that it brings because its impact isn't very measurable, you know, it's not very like quantifiable. Um, but I've just learned throughout the years that the role of art is very different than, you know, like other things. And it's really about being like a culture changer more than anything. And you can't really measure like how culture changes, but it's incredibly important for culture to change because if there are, you know, these solutions or these, you know, laws like trying to be implemented, like it's not going to work if there isn't a culture that's like ready to accept that. And so I've always seen as art as just this tool that can help change culture, help kind of shift common narratives and dialogues, and kind of just like give people a different perspective that they might have never considered before, which I think is incredibly important in the environmental, you know, justice movement, where we're thinking about, you know, who are like the most marginalized communities, you know, trying to empathize with, you know, animals and all these different living beings that initially we may not think about. So I definitely feel like art has its role in this movement.
Thank you. And Paul, it looks like you unmuted yourself, so I think you volunteered.
Yeah. And actually, I'd like to speak like specifically to how digital media helps to frame and operate within the environmental movement. And I kind of think about it in terms of like three different audiences: the general public, the allies, and the stewards. And within the general public, digital media helps to inspire awareness and interest in spaces, with the goal to effectively support campaign through imagery, celebratory, celebrity interest, you know, things like that. That way people understand spaces or issues or campaigns that are going on, without having that, as Nelly suggested, creating that cultural spur. Within allies, we're actually able to recruit support and donations of labor and time. Examples of this are like fiscal contributions, in-kind donations, travel, office, legal support, and you see that within a lot of these different movements. And it also helps to deepen that commitment of advocacy work within allies. And then stewards really helps documenting the efforts of stewards. Stewards I kind of see as people that are in or from spaces actively combating issues and embody kind of lifetime stewardship within activism. You know, there's allies are really tied to singular campaigns, and you're able to for a time be tied to a campaign or a place or something like that. But especially with indigenous peoples, you know, our ethnic identities are tied to place and tied to what people see as natural resources. And so we don't really get to leave the places or these campaigns. These are lifelong, this is lifelong work for people like myself. And so documenting our efforts grow and strengthen the community around us, finding pride in place, because a lot of the time there's huge amounts of lateral oppression that exist within cultural entities, providing a platform for stewards. And so it's not only this white saviorism that we see a lot in environmental movements. You don't really see up until the last 5 to 10 years recognition of indigenous voices or steward voices within massive media. And so giving ourselves those voices to represent, you know, the communities that are actually impacted. And then also, you know, make sure that that's ongoing, you know, building capacity for communities like mine to not only have that once or twice, but to make sure that's ongoing, to build visual sovereignty and self-determination within marginalized communities, so that they're not looking for others to empower them. They have that power within themselves in digital spaces.
Yeah, most definitely. I think that's really interesting to think about. You think of like traditional storytelling, you don't think about it being digitalized. And I think it's just so important to think about, well, how can we bring, you know, what we have to the future. So thank you so much. Grace, do you want to go next?
Sure. I think that art is a really great medium to articulate science to another audience that maybe wouldn't otherwise be reached by science. And I think especially for this climate justice movement and environmental movement, we can reach more people through art, different forms of art.
Most definitely, yes. I definitely agree with you. And I just think it's, it's just awesome to not have to read a newspaper sometime, that gets you down in the dumps, and just to be able to listen to a beautiful poem, but that actually makes you think. So thank you so much. And A.W.W, why don't you end it with what you have to say? I would love to hear it. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, I think some really, I'll say three things. I think art and creativity have the ability to make hard topics almost irresistible, because they interact with us in a different way. It's not necessarily always through the intellect. It's a little bit more through the senses, and a little bit more through like the intuition and this kind of like subconscious experience. So yeah, I just think that bodes well to creativity and activism and pushing for environmental justice. I also think that it is a great ability to start dialogues that are really difficult, and oftentimes dialogues that people will kind of like butt heads up against, or maybe get a little defensive about, but maybe talking about it or showing this idea through an art piece or through a poem or through digital media, it has this ability of opening up the conversation in a different way. A conversation maybe with yourself, and a conversation maybe also with others. So there, it can happen on multiple levels. Yeah, and then I also just think that art is incredibly important to challenging and dismantling narratives that are very violent and do not serve us. And I think that, yeah, art has always challenged the status quo. And I think that is definitely something that has always benefited the evolution of, of thinking and ideas and creativity and movement and steps forward into the future. So
Yeah, most definitely. Thank you. I know it's to think about. And that's why, I wish this webinar was a little longer, but we got about 2 minutes left, and I would just love to have all of you, and maybe like 25 to 30 seconds, give the audience one takeaway message that you want them to remember from this conversation. And A.W.W, why don't you go first since you're already unmuted?
Okay. I think that we need to make sure that we're pairing like spiritual work with like embodied and empathetic action. I think that they kind of need to go together, right? Like you need the internal work of figuring out how you perpetuate systems such as like racism and sexism and homophobia. Like how do we perpetuate those things, and working towards changing that, but then also taking that education, taking that learning, and putting it forward into your community, figuring out how to support people in your community who have less than, or are hurting, or are have human rights violations against them and the land. Like this is something.
Sorry, I gotta cut you off because we gotta get one message from everyone. I want to hear everyone. Sorry, so sorry. Thank you. No, you're good. Why don't you go ahead, because we got like 10 seconds, but let's hear it. Paul or Naomi or Grace?
The revolution is accessible. Self-educate on issues you find important. Find a campaign or community that inspires you, and give whatever you're able to. Time, labor, effort, financially, and kind, whatever.
I'd say listen to and create the platform for underrepresented and disproportionately affected people and allow them to have their voices and stories heard.
I'd say in relation to my video, our need to be aware of the ways oppressive structures try to silence environmental advocacy work so we know how to better defend against them.
You guys are awesome. Thank you so much for taking on the task of talking about why art and creative expression is so important to keep in mind as we strive to find just and sustainable transitions and solutions to address environmental injustices that are affecting us all. So I just want to thank you all again, and I want to say thank you to my team here at Beyond Toxics for helping me get through these technical difficulties, and for our panelists for hanging in there. And I just want to thank everyone who's joined us today. I think we had a good turnout, and I'm happy that we are able to raise awareness about these amazing youth artists. So if you remember their names and look them up and follow them, because they're doing some great work here in the world. So for updates and to find a recording of the webinar, we are going to plan to post it on our website at beyondtoxics.org. And we'll also post a copy of it on our social media, so our Facebook page. So thank you all again. And I hope everyone has a good rest of your day and stay safe and stay healthy. And thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone.